Welcome to Perfume on the Radio, a bi-monthly program presented by the Institute for Art and Olfaction, a nonprofit based here in Los Angeles, California, where the people are beautiful and the smells are plentiful. My name is Minetta Rogers, and I'll be hosting today's episode, which we're calling Wish You Were Here. If I could send you a postcard of today, the front would show the bustling streets of Chinatown, blue and white, as crowds of happy Dodgers fans find their way home after the game. The air is hazy and filled with the smell of fresh-cut jackfruit and incense and stubbed-out cigarettes. On the back, an address, a stamp, a simple message, "Wish you were here." I could carry on about the pleasures of snail mail in today's electronic era, rhapsodize on the throwback thrills of reading old magazines that recommend just a spritz of perfume on your love letters, discuss the correspondence between Napoleon and Josephine, and his infamous, if somewhat historically contested letter not to wash before he arrived. But anyhow, this episode explores scent through and of the postal system, from scratch and sniff stamps to shipping mishaps, mailed expressions of longing and nostalgia, delivery failures, all the frustrations and endeavors of getting a note from point A to point B. We'll be chatting with 4 creatives who work with scent, discussing how the postal system has enabled, enhanced, and even inspired their recent work. These interviews have been edited and condensed for clarity and length. First, Art Collective Research for the Bermuda Triangle's Regina Mamou and Laura Salmon will talk about mailing scent and nostalgia as part of Common Fantasy, now on display at the Venda Museum. Next, Jazz Brooks will discuss smell-o-vision, producing international scratch and sniff events, and high and low scent cultures. Throughout the episode, we'll have brief interludes with LA musician Emmitt James, who has a musical alert about our mail. These pieces were specially commissioned for the episode and have a message hidden in the music, if you know Morse code. Finally, we'll chat with Jack of all trades Donna Leibowitz about Lost Luggage, her recent postal olfactory art project. Regina Mamou and Laura Salmon are artists who together make up the collective Research for the Bermuda Triangle. They've presented their work at the Institute for Art and Olfaction, at the 2020 Experimental Scent Summit, and are currently showing at the Venda Museum in Culver City. Let's jump into our conversation with them about their piece, Common Fantasy.
Common Fantasy, it's become a getting on 1.5 year long project that Regina and I began to undertake last March. The aspect that we're really focusing on for this interview is that we have created a fragrance that is supposed to be reminiscent of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany in the post-World War II era. We did this by taking specific objects from East Berlin and from East Germany and tincturing them, extracting the scent to create a fragrance. And we have, in addition to this, we have an installation at the Venda Museum of the Cold War in Culver City. And originally the 2 projects were meant to be more married, but due to the pandemic, we have the installation and the Scent by Mail project. And so they're basically 2 parts to our one idea behind Common Fantasy, or creating this scent that's supposed to call back. We worked a lot with the word nostalgie, which means basically nostalgia for East Germany.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the scent extraction process? You said that you ordered specific food materials and also, I believe, building materials from East Germany?
Yes, that's correct. Actually, Laura happened to be in Berlin right at the start of when the pandemic hit the US. So basically like early March. So she had the ability actually to buy materials in Germany, in East Germany specifically. So she went to like a vintage clothing store to get a uniform. And she also, one of the most, serendipitous moments was she was doing a studio visit with an artist who happened to be located, his studio happened to be located in a former East German building. So she was able to get curtains and ceiling tiles and floor tiles and carpet so that we could use that for extraction. And then in addition to that, we started mining the German eBay. And what's really interesting about that is there's kind of like a whole section that we found that is dedicated to this concept of nostalgia for the East, or nostalgia. So we were able to buy those materials, and a lot of them actually had to be shipped, could not be shipped to the States. So it was shipped to Laura in Germany, and then she brought those things home with her. We had those materials, and then the thing that we ended up buying through German eBay was this box called an Ostpaket, and it's basically meant to be, again, another like nostalgic idea for East Germans, where they can get food items and food brands that were formerly East German. This is all new food products, but it's kind of a way to reminisce and have the foods maybe that you might have had when you were a child or growing up in East Germany.
Interesting. And then do you tincture each of these nostalgic materials individually and start blending them together?
Yes, that's correct. So basically, we decided that we wanted to use a tincture process because we really wanted to stay connected to the material itself and really pure in our process. Essentially, we've tinctured, I think, about 11 or 12 items so far. And this ranges from vintage items such as soap and cigarettes to things like new food products like roasted peanuts and raspberry candy. And so through the process, we would, go through a hydration process, mashing and hydration process with the particular item. And then we would put that through a dropping funnel for sometimes 24 to 48 hours to extract the scent. A lot of times we've been recharging the scents just to make them as strong as possible, because they are, with obviously using a tincture process, the scent is really subtle. So we've had to work within those kind of parameters of maybe not getting the scent that we think we should get, but more just allowing the materials to sort of speak for us and tell us what they want to smell like.
Yes, the technical challenges of working with those types of materials. I'm curious because I know that you've mentioned this in other interviews and artist talks, that you two have discussed the difficulties of striking the correct balance between creating a scent that's nostalgic versus about nostalgia. A couple months ago, you had discussed, are we going to let the mustiness be prominent versus the sweetness of the food that you had mentioned? So sort of the idea of a sense of nostalgia as in being in the moment that no longer exists versus a sense of nostalgia that's sort of the sad distance for a place that you can no longer attain.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. The objects that we chose to tincture, that was based off of, for the most part, asking people. Regina, her sister-in-law, grew up in East Germany, and my family is German, and I go to Berlin regularly. So we had a plethora of people to ask, like, what smells would remind them of the GDR era. And so we had all these specific things, but as you know, in the tincture process, because you have an object, theoretically, its scent may not tincture that well, and it may not smell like a whole lot. So we actually decided that was okay. And we are recharging a lot of the scents. We have had the scent tested on people who did experience the GDR, and it has brought up things for them. But we decided that we want to go with really the concept of using these objects to make the scent than necessarily constructing something that might be, say, like a little bit more synthetic. Because I mean, I think the tough thing too is that we're really working with memory, and it's not a memory that we have. So even if we decided to use other things to create the scent that we thought we were going for, there was some level of dishonesty maybe that we felt towards this, and like somehow the integrity of using the actual objects, especially when working with a museum like the Benda, which is so, their collection is so based on objects from that era, that we really wanted to, to stick to that. But I mean, I think there is this, we've learned a lot about scent and its relationship to nostalgia and memory, and learned about, for example, that your formative years in the womb and as a child, a lot of your memories are made through scent. And so that I'm not sure exactly how that plays out with the project. I mean, I think we'll know more when we really have our final fragrance and are shipping it off to places like Germany and then getting feedback from people.
Yeah. And actually, if I can just add on to that, I think we've really, over the last couple months now, having people smell both the samples of early formulas versus smelling the scents individually. It's interesting that, scent is a very subjective experience, like, art in general. And so, we have people that it brings up like a particular memory, but when we've combined the fragrance, I think we are trying to step away from the kind of archival scent versus a kind of conceptual scent. And that's, I think, as Laura is saying, because we haven't actually experienced East Germany during that time period, I think it makes the most sense and is the most, I think, more interesting to create a kind of conceptual scent of a particular landscape or urbanscape that no longer exists.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Not archival, but ambient.
Exactly.
And in the past. I'm sort of curious to some more of those responses. I know you said that, the responses for the people who both smelled your individual scent components and your iterated blends had different responses, but I would love to hear some anecdotes if you have anything that comes to the top of your head.
People pick up right away on the kind of like new food smells because they're obviously a lot brighter and like, I guess, crisper, if I could use those adjectives. So we've had a lot of people responding to this kind of like bright kind of fruity smell juxtaposed against the more like vintage or archival smells of the kind of like mustiness of a building. One of the comments actually was written about in Hyperallergic was this kind of bittersweet quality that we really appreciated because it sort of touches on, both the idea of the actual place and this kind of conceptual place. So I think that was definitely one comment that we really liked a lot. We get a lot of like mustiness with the fragrance, but when people smell the individual scents, it's interesting to try to have them kind of really narrow in on a particular scent profile for each item and to see kind of like what their reactions are. What do you think, Laura?
Well, I think back to, so we did artists talk about this project for the Friends of Contemporary Art, and where we sent out our first version of the fragrance, and it was kind of a prototype. And I think back to, we were able over Zoom, we all opened the fragrance together and sprayed it on our wrists and smelled it. What I remember most from that time is, for one, Regina's sister-in-law, Juliana, who grew up in East Germany. This brought back memories, she said, of her grandfather and of like a certain place she used to go with her grandfather. But I remember also a lot of people really picked up on the tobacco smell, and those were the smokers.
Huh.
One thing that we got a pointer from Saskia with is that we were tincturing just these old Caro Zigaretten, which is the brand that was used during the GDR. We were tincturing the cigarette, and she said that, well, they should be smoked and then tincture more of those ashes or the burnt tobacco, because that's actually the smell that, like, no one goes and smells a fresh box of cigarettes. The smell that we're associated with is, or the smell that we might have memory recall to, is the smell of them being smoked, or maybe the lingering from the ashtray.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so true. The stubbed out cigarette is such a distinct smell.
So yeah, it's really true. And on that, also with the cigarettes, what's funny too is, the Caro brand cigarettes, the East German brand of cigarettes, they were kind of it was a lot of like cheap tobacco, like not high quality tobacco. So like over time you take like cheap tobacco and it's like a vintage pack of cigarettes. It was way less pungent than we expected. But again, that's sort of like the challenges, but also the interesting and fun parameters of like, again, dealing with a vintage smell that we like want to say, for example, that the cigarettes will smell a certain way, but they end up smelling a totally different way because they're, it's just not like a fresh box. So those are some of the challenges and parameters that we had to work within.
Yeah, it seems like you've had quite a few technical challenges to overcome while making the piece. Another thing that I'm curious about, because you've just talked about having a bottle sent to everyone who attended this online artist talk, and everyone smelling it in their respective places, is sort of the feedback that you've gotten from a distance. You said you've mailed some things out, and for the people who weren't present to smell with you, or even contemporaneously smelling with you, what has that feedback been like?
As Laura was saying, the sort of like, we're all kind of like unboxing together as we did with, FOCA Fellows of Contemporary Art. So we definitely had, a lot of the musty smells, the kind of like archival smells with the brightness of the food. When we've mailed it out, I would say the one sort of that we can point to is the box that we sent to Renee Resman, who wrote for Hyperallergic, with her comments about it being a bittersweet smell. And so our prototype kind of like packaging is a vial of the fragrance, so the mixed scents. Then everybody gets a little card with all the ingredients listed. So, the building materials, the uniform, etc. So they kind of do have a guide in some way, which is a little bit of a, I guess, not a cheat for us, but a way to sort of encourage some really close, like, smelling or scent experience, because people are able to see on this list, for example, oh, there's newspaper and there's soap and there are these other things that might not be an immediate smell. It might be like a lingering smell. So it's allowed people to sort of dig a little bit deeper through their experience of, olfaction. And then in addition to that, we included postcards where people could write their scent experience when they were alone, and then they could mail it back to us with their comments. And so for FOCA, for example, we did get a lot of postcards back. And again, there was an overwhelming sense, no pun intended, of it being musty and smoky. And so it made us realize too that we have to get a little bit more nuanced with our vintage smells. And so that in itself is like really trying to create these separations and distinctions between things like, the difference between like a floor tile and a bunch of newspapers, which is kind of hard to differentiate when you have the actual formula mixed.
Yeah, technical challenges and your composition.
This has been, actually, we've been working with scent in our art collaborative for a long time now. We did hydrodistillation, and we tried to extract the scent of a dollar bill. Did not have so much success with that. We've thought a lot about scent, and this is the first time that we've really tried to build a fragrance and done a more like formal tincturing process. And this was a lot based on workshops and information that we got from the Institute for Art and Olfaction. And so this has been like our collab. We tend to have unusual methodologies, but scent has been the strand that stuck through most of our work together. we'll see where it goes next, but this is definitely the first time that we've created a fragrance. And it's also the first time that we've done a project together that doesn't have a live component. So that's been really interesting to think about, COVID and the mail. And definitely originally we were planning there would be a more performative aspect with the release of the scent, or there would be like a diffusion at the museum, which obviously couldn't happen because people need to wear masks. So yeah, I would just say that I think that we'll probably continue to work with scent, as that's been what we've had the most success and interest in together.
Yes, and just to add to that, as Laura was speaking about, it's kind of funny because we kind of accidentally fell into olfactory art, and even with, like, let's say our first intervention project together called Contradyne, while it wasn't necessarily supposed to be about scent, it kind of accidentally turned into being about scent because we were burning food for the project. We were creating like a charcoal or a kind of like burnt dinner that you couldn't actually eat. It was more of like an aesthetic that we were trying to achieve. And because we had to blacken the food, we had to put it in like a toaster oven for hours and hours on end until it was smoking a lot. And this happened for almost 4 days consistently. The smoky element of that became a huge part of our project from the very start. Even when we're not necessarily dealing with scent directly, it's definitely been this indirect part which operates kind of in the background. And so, as Laura said, this is the first time that we're really now saying, okay, we've done a lot of different processes to achieve, scent. And now, we've taken more formal classes at the IAO. And so we're using now what we've built upon over the last 3 years, become more technical. And I think this is great for us because now we're able to control the project a lot more than we were able to do in the past.
Yeah. Scent as a material or a medium really works. You see what we call ourselves research for the Bermuda Triangle, looking for something that's unknown, that you can't see, that you can't touch. And so scent as this kind of invisible thing in this field, the art world that's so much based on aesthetic, has been the variety of ways that we've been able to use it has really added rigor to the concepts behind our work.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to experience some of your olfactory art pieces. And I do think, the circumstances were obviously not ideal. The composed olfactory art of this particular piece was so exciting. And the circumstances sort of reinforced the meditative aspect of it, the abstract aspect of it, just because there was that distance from the visual piece that is part of the larger Common Fantasy project. And now it's something that you receive discreetly and you have to contemplate on your own, even though, your work is present with the audience. Sorry, that was unclear, but
no, that was really clear. And just to say too, our installation comes down at the Venda Museum, I think September 2nd. We've been so overwhelmed in a great way, in a really positive way with the support. So we've had about 300 signups so far from 35 different countries. So we've had overwhelming support for the project, and it's really exciting to be able to send as far, to places like Latvia and Pakistan, and of course a lot to Germany. So it's going to be really exciting to hear feedback from people from an international community.
What exactly does Common Fantasy smell like? Research for the Bermuda Triangle explains next.
Common Fantasy, fragrance of the GDR.
EDC soap, Free German Youth Uniform, GDR building relics, Hansa cookies, Caro cigarettes, Neues Deutschland newspapers, raspberry candies, roasted peanuts.
That was research for the Bermuda Triangle. Folks in the Los Angeles area may visit the installation of Common Fantasy at the Venda Museum of the Cold War in Culver City through September 2nd, 2021. Next, we chat with Jazz Brooks, an artist and PhD student in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago Human-Computer Integration Lab. If you've attended the Institute for Art and Olfaction's Meet and Know series, you may have watched Saskia Wilson-Brown's recent interview with them. They also produce the Twitch and Sniff Along and Scent in Cinema series, both of which we will discuss in this interview. Why scratch and sniff? Why smell? And why animation?
I've always been kind of curious about it because it's often seen as like a lowbrow kind of form of media. I guess it's probably people's visions of it because it was marketed heavily as stickers for children and in the 80s especially, as well as John Waters' infamous Polyester, which was released with 8 scratch and sniff labels for the film experience itself. And when I was talking to Tammy Bernstock about doing a screening of The Tale of Old Whiff, this was probably mid-2020, I would say. I'm starting to lose track of the dates. She had mentioned that she produced the scratch and sniff cards for A Tale of Old Whiff already. And so I was starting to look at like scratch and sniff in general. And I was like, oh, wait, this is the kind of thing that you can actually send via the mail easily. When you're doing these kinds of events online, a big factor is then going to become how expensive one person is to attend and to actually post those kinds of objects. And so anything that can be flat packed or just sent in a regular mail format makes it super accessible. It's about 50 cents for a regular mail object, a letter, or like $1, I think, for mailing internationally. So that meant that we could potentially create these kinds of events that brought some limelight on scratch and sniff, smell, and film in a way that was safe for COVID and could also reach a pretty wide audience internationally and nationally. So in 2016, I collaborated with the Institute for Art and Olfaction on a new participatory version of Scent of Mystery with sprays, odors, that was shown at the TCM Festival, and I think also in the UK, if I remember right. When they were restoring that film, they actually accidentally came across a companion short film called Tale of Old Whiff that was thought to have been lost, and that was shown as a Scent of Mystery. And as the first and only animation produced for Smell-O-Vision. And so that one in particular, Tammy actually produced scratch and sniff cards.
And you had mentioned meeting up with Tammy and discussing the possibility of creating these scratch and sniff cards for the Tale of Old Whiff, that she said had the secret key to making scratch and sniff technology more available to you and her as artists.
There's a company in Tennessee, I believe, that essentially allows people to do small batch orders. So that's the concern, right? Is that when you're doing with larger companies, I think there's one in the UK called Aroma Corporation, and they have the scratch and sniff cards for polyester, for example. But when you want to order like a few, you have to essentially order enough to reach like a certain quota. And that was way out of our price range for what we could do. What I realized from Tammy's original experience is that if you do what she was doing, which is go with this smaller company and order stickers on a clear backing, you can instead separate out the printing. And so you have one company doing cheap printing of the cards themselves, and then the other company in Tennessee, Print-A-Scent, produced these stickers, and then you manually assemble it. So I spent hours at home just like affixing the dots and other shapes to the cards, but it's what makes that kind of that possible, the scale.
And so the Tale of Old Whiff, how did you guys come up with what ended up being the smells that were printed out on the stickers?
Yeah, so Tammy already had them completed, I think a couple of years back, 2018, 6 of the 8 odors that she chose. So the original short film had 15, I believe, and none of the odors still exist. So all Tammy had to work off was basically a list of odors that were included in some documents that mentioned the short film, and then choosing to produce it, and then collaborated both with Print-A-Scent, which has a fragrance library. That's often where books or things like that might already just like grow into that domain and use whatever's originally available. And so Tammy did a bit of that. And then 2 of the odors are actually formulated by Neil Harrison of Scent Events. One of them is called Bone, which I believe like it doubles up as like the odor of an actual dry bone, as well as the odor of the like velvet hole for the bone in a bone perfume in the short film. And then another one called Field of Flowers, right, where the main character with finally is able to smell again and runs through an entire field that has this very like 60s, almost trippy experimental montage with odor added to it. And then I think for other projects, so for like the game series, those ones are a bit harder because the cards are still in circulation. So Leather Goddesses of Phobos still has things in circulation on eBay, or Leisure Suit Larry. I didn't include the original game designers, which I should have in hindsight. There were some mismatches in terms of the quality of the odor. For example, Banana, I had to use stock fragrances that were already available to reduce the costs. And Banana, for example, in Leather Goddesses of Phobos, the one from Print to Scent comes more out as like a candy banana, I would say, whereas the original one was more of like a freshly opened banana peel kind of quality. And that's been kind of interesting because a lot of these companies like 3M were very prominent in the 80s have largely closed down and none of their formulations are released publicly. So you have basically like this generation of books and other media you use scratch and sniff that are basically going to disappear, both because of the ephemerality of scratch and sniff and because there's no current efforts in trying to log those odors to reproduce them in the future.
In your Meet a Nose chat, you mentioned one of your efforts being to sort of take the speculative fiction out of writing about historical scents in games such as Leisure Suit Larry, trying to recreate and assemble those scents where possible. That is really interesting and also sort of the fundamental challenge of all small projects, right? They're ephemeral.
Absolutely. I think I guess it's the same, in some sense, same issue as like Osmotech, except in some sense, these odors are so, there's no like value necessarily seen in stock fragrances, I guess. And they're so ubiquitous, either in how they were originally distributed or things like that. There's no apparent value in trying to conserve that, which is pretty odd because there's going to be like this weird moment where all of this stuff is basically going to disappear experientially.
There is something to be said for stock fragrances because so many of those stock fragrances form the background of our lives. And, you can go back into newspapers and read other people getting mad. There was a case in Australia where someone reformulated, again, a glue, and everyone got furious that the glue didn't smell the way it used to.
Absolutely. I think it's very similar also to like, maybe not stock particularly, but like laundry detergents and things like that, these objects that kind of ambiently exist in our spaces that we don't think about too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Taking it back to scratch and sniff. So you mentioned earlier that scratch and sniff is sort of thought of as a childlike or childish object primarily. Are there other uses?
Yeah. I mean, there's been like a lot of different cases in marketing or things like that where they'll use it. It makes sense for the food market, right? I've seen, I think there was like a company that did that in the Netherlands so that you can actually experience the odor of the jam before you actually buy it.
No way.
Yeah. And then there's like an art piece that was pretty interesting. That's more of a design piece. I think it was called like the Madeleine. It looked like a biscuit, or Mary's biscuit box might have been what it's called. So it's this like inflated injection molded plastic box, very translucent, where you would put those like butter biscuits or cookies. The surface, or like the plastic, was mixed with microencapsulated odors, or the surface was coated so that it also smelled of those biscuits. So you would also be able to like, there seems to be like some kind of interest in using this technology as a means to give you an idea of something on the inside of something else to protect it, release the odor. Other use cases have been things like books, which have also either printing or scratching of stickers as different methods of adhering it to. Tammy and I have been gathering like a spreadsheet of like 55 or 60 films and television series that have used scratch stickers or cards in some way. I think the technology itself, like microencapsulation, is pervasive in other areas like garbage bags or clothing, places where you want to kind of have either a slow release of your odor or kind of keep its odor, then release it eventually. And this stuff is the perfect, right? So even like hot weather can potentially start making it like release odors. There was a friend / a mentor who was mentioning a story from their wife, and she was saying that her wife was working at Paramount, I think, and the room where they had the polyester scratch and sniff cards was flooded.
Oh, no.
So she walked in and it ended up smelling like all of those odors, with skunk, feet, everything.
Yeah, I do think that there's really interesting stuff going on in design, as you mentioned, but perhaps there's more of a reticence to engage with sort of scratch and sniff technology in the art space, or am I misunderstanding that?
I think there's a couple examples of it. Microencapsulation was used by Cecile Tolas for one of her art projects where she coated the wall with scratch and sniff microencapsules. And then same thing with Peter Couperet, where he had, I believe, portraits that were blank, but that had the odors as like a slurry applied onto the painting. The difference that I kind of wanted to draw with those projects is that it's not necessarily like a scratch and sniff book is fascinating because it's trying to shove in 12 odors with a narrative. And that's very different from using scratch and sniff as like a means to apply one odor to a space. But it's also interesting because like it's not the same as like going into a room with the odor being diffused. It's really about getting close to the object and bring your nose to that level.
You had a comment about how one of the interesting things about both polyester and the Phobos game is using the anticipation of the smell in sort of contrast with the smell that is unscratched and may or may not be exactly what you expect. In the Phobos game, there's a text-based description of walking into a bathroom, and they really go into, how disgusting it is, and they ask you to smell a thing, which when scratched and smelled is the smell of pizza and not a disgusting bathroom, as opposed to the art pieces that you just mentioned, which are sort of there's less of a you will probably smell X when you interact with Y object.
Yeah, there's like it's pretty fascinating because I guess in this media, the artists that have played around with it, like John Waters or Steve Moretsky, I guess with John Waters, he kind of set up an expectation for what you're going to be experiencing, and that kind of plays off of what people's the popular vision of what smell-o-vision would be. And everything in smell-o-vision is, of course, supposed to be one-to-one mappings that are realistic. So you're going to walk in and you're going to experience the orange when the orange is cut. Whenever smell-o-vision is mentioned, they're like, I would hate to have this because if I ever went on Twitter, I would have like people sending me fart jokes or something horrifying like that, which I question. I don't think we send each other all like horrifying content constantly. It's very like contextually driven, some moderation and things, but ignoring that part, they're definitely playing a lot with that kind of anticipation and the expectation of what an odor should be when it has something else with it. And that can either be the context visually or textually. It's very clever uses of how smell is so context dependent that make it really interesting. And they're kind of lowbrow jokes.
Yes.
Waters is things like, oh, you're about to smell a rose, and then enter the frame as like two smelly shoes, something weird like that. It shows like an understanding of how smell works. That's very fun, I guess.
Total tangent. I assume you have read Deji Bryce-Lugoton's short story about content moderating for smells online.
Oh, I have not read that.
It's a speculative piece of fiction about, sort of those content moderation farms. And the technology has been developed such that people can sync smells to sort of their YouTube world star style videos. And so the content moderators have to go through and watch horrific stuff and see if the smells also are as equally horrific as the pranks, the violence, etc. It's a really interesting take on technology being too online, having to manage sort of like the online human interface. It's definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, I would love to link to that.
Yeah.
Just to be fair, there's a lot of artworks that are also thinking about context and like how to subvert it or things like that. But it's pretty fascinating that like this world where people are using scratch and sniff and are not necessarily like olfactory artists training or how they identify themselves. That's a very big tool to their trade, I guess. I guess when you're entering things like scented film or scented video games, subverting context seems to be a very common practice or something that like is immediately thought of and implemented. The humor part, that's definitely super accurate, because I was talking to someone else who's like, there isn't that much going on with like the world of humor and smell that I know of. Knock on wood, I'm probably going to make some people angry. I don't know if it's partially because like the art world and smell is looking to basically legitimize themselves. And so making things that are just like humorous might be seen as contradictory or in vain of that effort.
Yeah, humor is also one of those things that's more culture or scene specific, and I feel like it might not travel as well as the aspirations of modern day art. I do want to go back to sort of your mail project, you know, about the behind the scenes. What were some of the challenges for putting together your scratch and sniff online screenings?
I guess like overall there weren't very many hiccups or bumps that I experienced. The biggest one was basically the initial budget costs and estimating that. Some design aspects, especially how to make sure that the letters stick out in the mail, people don't just throw it out, was one thing that I was trying to consider. I have like another couple other products that use scratch and sniff, more complicated, and in ways more complicated than one sticker per area that has odors, where it kind of like fraction it and compose fragrances by assembling stickers together. And the issue is that with it's not about like the surface area, but the precision. So like how well you have to register the odors, because when you're doing so many repeated actions, it becomes really daunting as one person just sitting there for like maybe 14 hours. And it sounds really simple when you say like, oh, the scratch and sniff card has 8 odors, but that's 8 odors times 200 cards. Plus you have to do potentially sealing. We started sealing the cards in plastic so that the odors wouldn't be kind of like exuding out of the card already, since it would scratch against the interior of the letter. It's just such a fascinating thing because there's no resources online for this stuff, which is a shame. So a lot of it you just kind of learn out of practice and in the moment.
Yeah, you're sort of carving out new territory there. Can I ask how many times it took before you guys realized to apply the plastic seal so you wouldn't lose the scratch and sniff smell in transit?
It wouldn't necessarily be lost as much as like I had a couple friends give me some feedback for A Tale of a Whiff, and a lot of them mentioned they would put their card in a corner of their house because when they would open it, it would just have like a mirror of the odors. And I think like sealing it's fine in that it'll stop the odor from kind of like diffusing into your living room with like no descript idea of what the odor is. I guess like the future step would probably be something like a filter or guiding people to fan out their card in front of a fan by the window or something, so that it kind of removes or deodorizes some of the diffused odors. I think most of it was due to the friction between the scratch labels and the inside of the letter when it's just being mailed. And so I was hoping that by sealing it, it would at least remove some of the friction.
I have in the mail coming to me some of the USPS's scratch and sniff stamps that were issued in 2018. And apparently there was quite a lot of concern about those scratch and sniff stamps getting their scent all over all the other mail while in transit.
Totally understand that. And the other part that was like ordered natural gas ones. And that there's infamous stories about like natural gas companies mailing like warnings where it would include like a sniffle of natural gas odor.
Oh.
And yeah, and some people online had mentioned stories of being like, I thought I had a gas leak at home, because it would kind of just passively diffuse. And the company Printascent, actually, you can order the slurries, the microencapsulate slurries, to screen print on your own. So I've been practicing that for myself out of curiosity. One of the ones that you can't order is natural gas, because I'm guessing like if the USPS sees like gets a hint of the odor, opens it and sees like a liquid that's exuding it, they'll probably be like, okay, this is probably something illegal.
Yes. So I was wondering, sort of in the animation, VR, Twitch game space, what your thoughts about pairing scent with those activities are?
Realistically, at this point, that biggest barrier is, there's a couple of different barriers. The price of these devices is astronomical, right? What's been nice about Scratch and Sniff, since it's so cheap, since it's so easy. The downside is that you have to tell people when to do things. So like the games that kind of work with that, and Simon Niedenthal has like a pretty interesting paper that touches this briefly. Stuff text adventures or point and clicks, because you have enough time in the game world to actually just like let the game do its own thing and then pick up the odor, scratch it and smell. And that takes 6 seconds maybe or more. But people often view it as like a break from gameplay, which I don't think is necessarily, but it's enough that you can't do it for things like a fast-paced puzzle game or online cooperative game unless it's thinking about its pace. The nice thing though is that because it's microencapsulated, you can have multiple odors in the same surface area.
I mean, I was particularly struck by the smell by voting that you had in your Twitch stream. Shall we smell the vomit or not? Or the pizza or not? The in-text reactions to that versus the first time that I met you, which was your presentation of, you are in this VR experience, the smells are getting fed to you, you will not necessarily have control over that. And I do think that, the consent and control aspect is something that is not always talked about with regards to scent design in game space and art space, in everyday civic life, but it is definitely a consideration.
Two people that I think I especially have been chatting about this, there's Tammy, who's been thinking about this idea of like opt-in experiences, especially for people that might be sensitive or might be overwhelmed by certain odors. Elia Driva, they're a student in New Mexico. They did a game called Odum. They've been thinking about more and more. Basically, I would call it like opt-in experiences. How do you make sure that there is the option to remove the odor or adjust it, right? You could like make it be further away. I think a lot of other artists might have done that inadvertently. Things like, or knowingly, devices that are kind of like limited in the space that it can actually produce the odor in. And what's nice about that, at least with the Scratch and Sniff, is it's in that case, it was kind of negotiated, right? There was, for people that didn't want to experience it, there was the opportunity to experience it via the descriptions of others or catch up afterwards or things like that. Or you might like smell it from further away, which is nice. I really loved those discussions because it kind of pointed to the intersubjectivity of odor. A lot of the experiences that you have online are kind of assuming that it's uniform across all people, that, or at least like that, you're basically delivering a perfect experience for the smell, that it's like the same intensity, they're getting the same stuff, and it's assumed almost that it's an isolation. And that online form chat and the Scratch had a similar situation where people would offer up their interpretation of what the odor is, which I don't think is wrong, as much as it's almost necessary. There's like that desire to want to communicate what you're experiencing, get a better understanding. And from the group communicating together, we have a broader, more robust understanding of what the smell is. And I wish there were more experiences designed for that. I don't know. It's kind of refreshing because like things like John Waters stuff, even though he's not interested, it seems like he's not interested in redoing Odorama for one of his future projects. People even in the 70s, I think Gene Siskel writes about this in his review for Polyester. He says that's what's amazing about this isn't that the odors are super accurate. It's the experience of being laughed at by the film, but more importantly, being able to like laugh at yourself and in unison with a theater. And so oftentimes these theater experiences are so ingrained on like forget your body and forget what's around you, that it's really refreshing to have this kind of situations where it's like, oh, engage with other people, talk to them. There's something almost unique that when it comes to smell, because it does activate desire to talk to other people and that need. We might not have individual fantastic words for describing it, but when you have like three people describing an odor, you end up getting a lot of words and maybe associative thoughts that give us a better understanding of what it is. I think it's been this combined with like the mail format has just been so fantastic because it's the people that attended, for example, a Tale of Old Whiff was, I think it was like across like 10 or more countries internationally. Wow. It's like all over the place. And what's exciting about that is that I guess it's not locked as much in like one cultural expectation of what the odor is. It's really nice being able to, from different continents and countries, log on at the same time and converse about this.
That was Jazz Brooks. As a brief aside, the U.S. Postal Service introduced their first scratch and sniff stamps in 2018. These featured watercolor illustrations of popsicles and have a sweet and fruity scent when scratched. They're still available online if you search USPS frozen treats. That was Emmitt James, a musician based in Los Angeles. We specially commissioned these pieces for the episode. We check in next with Donna Leibowitz, who you may have heard on previous episodes of Perfume on the radio. A documentarian and scent maker in Los Angeles. Here she is introducing her recent project, Lost Luggage.
Lost Luggage, in its simplest form, is a scented holiday letter that I created to send to smell friends to cheer everyone up during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a real-life mini-documentary in a letter based on my own real experiences, using scent, poems and photos about the misadventures of a group of mostly British women on a drunken bachelorette week in Croatia. It's 2017. It's the peak of summertime in Europe. Lost Luggage is an art project aimed to transport you to a new place or to evoke memories of a place you've been. I wanted to take you on a virtual holiday with me in the form of a simple letter. We were all getting everything delivered, too scared to touch anything. Piles of boxes in quarantine, all the mail was boring. So I made my letter fun and curious on arrival. Every part of the letter is carefully chosen to be on theme. The brown envelope, to look like what you might receive your lost item in, to my colourful pink return address label at the top left that tells you it's not a bill. So it's truly analogue. Part of the project too, during COVID, was that I had to be able to post out the letters safely without having to go inside a postal office. I purchased the stamps online and figured out the correct postage for both local and international letter postage. Was masked up with hand sanitizer. You know, my husband and I, we made a special mission to walk to the post office in Los Feliz, nearest to our home here in Los Angeles, during peak COVID times, to post these letters. It was one of the few times that we left home for such a mission. And it was kind of emotional, really. It was a big deal, making that trip to post those letters.
We chatted with Donna Leibowitz about creating a fragrance that could travel through the post, working on art projects that engage multiple senses, and more. Let's jump into that conversation now.
Well, I started learning about scent, how to create scent, a couple of years ago, and I'm obsessed with it now. I did think back to a lot of these letters that I sent years ago I used to say when I was a teenager, I sent letters to my relatives in Germany, and they always, like whenever I visit, which I don't visit very often, whenever I do, that's one of the things they always bring up is, oh, you used to send those lovely letters. I made handmade paper and scented them with like rose oil from the Body Shop. I was like, I don't know, I was like 14 when I sent those. Not any particular relevance for why I used that oil, but it sort of, I feel like it locked in a time or something with that moment. And they always remember that. Like it's more than a letter then, if the scent triggers something else. Yeah, I think it locks in a time. Anyway, so, you know, everyone's thinking about their sense of smell more. So I think it doesn't even matter if you're a smell enthusiast. I think people were responding more, I noticed. Even just, you know, my in-laws and friends who weren't particularly smell obsessed were finding it. We're getting something from that. And I think also why I use scent in this way, in a subtler way. I didn't want to make it just about the scent. It had like a story, it had photos and everything like that. So I sort of wanted you just to get immersed and interpret it.
And can you tell me a little bit more about the story that was tied into your lost luggage program?
So why did I think about? I thought about doing these scented holiday letters because no one can go on holidays, right? Because of COVID lockdown, like a week-long holiday in Croatia, which is quite a big thing. There were about 6 of us or so, and we all went along, and it was like exactly what you would expect. It was, you know, drunken chaos. So the point of it all is it wasn't, you know, not a holiday necessarily that everybody can relate to, but it was just a simple holiday, like almost like a family holiday, just like the fact that we lost our luggage. And so many people can relate to that, having lost their luggage. And that's why I called it lost luggage. I think it's just like that whole feeling of like that's it, everything's over, the holiday is ruined. But then you have to think, well, when you think back, I was hoping that would trigger a memory in people, that they would remember not only that they lost their luggage, but then think, oh yeah, also we had this fabulous time in such and such a place, and we met these interesting people, and then they start remembering this really nice time in their life about when they had an adventure. The smell and the memory, all those things are so heavily connected. So it's kind of like a bit of a long shot. But if I created the scent of the luggage, lost luggage area in Dubrovnik, that's kind of a generic smell, really. It could be any interior. You could translate that into any place in the world. Yeah, and then trigger that memory of the holiday for somebody. I think I personally have these sort of scent snapshots. And I remember just sort of almost sitting on the floor in despair, and just the smell just down there, you know, of the air conditioning. And, you know, we're all so hot, and everyone we had a really great morning. You know, we had mimosas for breakfast, and then to turn up, you know, there's just this sort of like, it's this sort of like excited sweat. I could smell everyone's sweat. And then, you know, I think I even for the first time got a spray tan. So all these chemicals, all these sort of feminine chemicals that I didn't really, all that was together on me. And also the smell of the air conditioning and the leathery kind of, it's not even leather, it's like a vinyl, you know, almost new carpet smell. And that sort of then contrasted with every time the doors open at the airport, and it's warm air just billows right in, and even the smell of cigarettes, because everyone is allowed to smoke, you know, there, even though no one's allowed to smoke at the airport. Someone's just been smoking, or do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's a mixture. It's sort of a pretty smell too, in a way, because it's exciting. But then when you relate that to being stuck when you're meant to be going enjoying yourself, all the smells, all the bad smells, but also the smells of like covering up, you know, the deodorant, you know, everyone's spraying deodorant everywhere because it's so much hotter than it is in England.
You've described it as the smell of almost made it. Exacerbation, yes. Exhaustion, then acceptance.
Yeah, it's all the stages. It's all the emotional stages, right? Because at the beginning, you just can't believe it. It can't be, you know, they have to be here. You know, it's a Hendrik and all the presents, you know.
And so how did you create this particular smell of going through the 5 stages of grief when it comes to your travel gear?
Well, I really was first just thinking literally about what does the suitcase smell like, first of all. And I was thinking about, you know, like that lovely smell of like when you open your luggage and it's been in the cargo hold, you know, and it's kind of got those sort of fumes. They're different, you know, the jet fuel fumes, different from like being in your car or something like that. That alone reminds me of a holiday.
Because this was a piece of art that you had to send by mail, I was wondering what particular challenges you had when you were designing scents that had to travel for a considerable distance.
Yeah, it was a real challenge. And there was lots of time tests, lots of envelopes lying around the house with dates and times on them, and some I forgot about. And obviously it had to be base note heavy. It had to last on the strip, on a tester strip, for at least 2 weeks, I figured, for it to have a chance at anyone being able to even detect it. And I know I've got a pretty sensitive nose, so it had to be, my husband had to be able to smell it as well, although I've trained him since in the last little while. I did a lot of tests with other long-lasting materials, just first of all, uniquely, individual materials. How long does that last? How long does that last? How long does that last? And what does that smell like? How's that going to smell, a week later? Is that going to, because some materials can turn kind of acetone, things change, right, as you know. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be horrible for people when I opened it, and smelt it. And also I wanted it doesn't have to be exactly like it does out of the bottle, but I wanted it to have at least the key characters from it so that the story would get across.
One of the pieces did not make it fully intact. Possibly the postal carrier or someone who had been handling it spilled coffee on the envelope.
That's right. And I'm sure Virginia wouldn't mind me saying what it was, but we had a nice little email conversation about it. She says, when I first smelt the envelope, prior to opening, it had a sweet, almost red fruit note. Upon opening, however, that had changed to a powdered gourmand affair with creamy hazelnut coffee, sweet caramel and nutty coffee, and perhaps even some maple sugar and vanilla thrown in. She went on to describe a lot of things. Then she picked up a skin scent, like floral, sweaty skin on a warm fabric. And that's more close to what it was. But it's very interesting because the whole coffee kind of a thing that she got from it, the gourmand bit, there really aren't any notes like that in the perfume. So I guessed, I speculated that maybe the postie had their coffee on and breakfast, maybe a muffin, sat down on the letter on the way, and that became more interesting to us in our chat, because it was almost like, well, then that changes the smell, and that's okay too, because that wouldn't be completely wrong. But it's interesting how the physicality of putting it in a letter and sending it through all these different physical places, obviously that's going to, change the scent. Yeah, so things change in transit.
There is something lovely about, in this particular moment, creating a piece of art that, will be handled by an audience, by the person that you're intending to send the message to, as well as hundreds of strangers.
Yeah, for sure. And I always have liked the idea of not just sharing art with art galleries or artists, but I always feel extra happy when I give my art to, say my in-laws, and they get something out of it. And in Australia, that the letter made it to Australia, which was great. So that was nice. They enjoyed it. Yeah, that makes me happy. Obviously Perfume friends are going to enjoy it in a different way. They're going to get another level out of it. But I kind of like the simplicity of just, oh, it smells nice. I was listening to the Bremen Smell It talk. What keeps coming up is that whole it's olfactory art, but I think there's a lot of people talking about it just being art, and I kind of like that. I'm leaning towards that too, just everything. Poetry, writing, smell, touch, whatever you can use to get it out there. Doesn't really matter what it is. I don't think you should be, I have to only do smell, I only do this. Also, I have a film background, so, all those things, it all seems to be trying to tell the same story in the end,
Upon opening the envelope, what am I going to smell, and what do those different scent notes represent?
Right. It smells like what it says, like lost luggage. I wanted people to smell things that smell to them like luggage and sunscreen. Those are the two key things that make up the scent, and that are the two indicators, of the story. And then you can go from there, whether you pick up on any subtle florals or tobacco notes or animalic notes or sweaty notes or details. I think that's interpretive to you.
Briefly note to our audience that you had previously also been working with scent and VR, and this is sort of a pivot in presenting the materials and the story from what you had been working on prior.
Well, right when COVID was happening, I was mucking around with doing VR stuff, and I'd made a little kind of walk around God and Alice in Wonderland inspired thing in VR. When I learned about perfume, I started thinking about everything. Everything had to be really complex, and the smells were going to, have a whole journey on their own. But I realized when you start to put scent in something else other than just perfume, you have to respect your other senses as well. And you also just have to understand that you can be easily led with small details. So I just simplified things a lot. I learned a lot from doing that. So somehow, even though it's very different, the VR and letters, somehow they kind of it's the same though, because I'm still trying to just give you hints and lead you on a journey. I guess with the letter, you have to choose to sit down and take some time to open it. Whereas when you have a VR headset on, you're in. Yeah. So you have to you have to choose yourself. It's like watching a movie or reading a book. But yeah, it's not that dissimilar. And I think by realizing that, I think doing the letters is going to help the VR, and the VR has helped the letters. I know it's easy to get lost in all the tech of VR and how cool it is and what things you can do. And, you've always got to circle back as an artist to try and think, what's the story do I want to tell? What do I want to tell you?
In this episode, we've talked a lot about smells being sent through the mail. Now, let's turn to a moment when the smell of the mail uncovered a thief. In 1924, the Laurinburg Exchange reported that a great many registered letters and packages in the southwestern section of the United States were opened and the contents were removed. After much difficulty, the location of the robberies was finally narrowed down to one of 6 post offices. The only clue to the mystery was that after the packages had been rifled, they were sealed. Upon this frail clue, inspectors worked for several months. Finally, one of the inspectors was struck with an idea, but because it did not seem very important, he decided to try it out without confiding in other inspectors at work on the case. Before long, an envelope that had been robbed of its contents and then resealed was given to him. He quickly moistened the mucilage on the flap and held the envelope to his nose. After taking a good long sniff, he stated that he would have the mystery solved within a week. What he had done was to prepare 6 lots of mucilage, each with a different perfume: lilac, lily of the valley, violet, mignonette, rose, and heliotrope. This mucilage he distributed among the 6 offices under suspicion. In resealing this letter, the thief had used the mucilage, and when the inspector sniffed the perfume, he traced the office from which the theft took place.
You got something in the mail and it smells good. You got something in the mail and it smells good. You got something in the mail and it smells good. You got something in the mail and it smells good.
So, check your mailbox, recycle your junk mail, and don't forget to cross-check your postage against your package weight before going to the post office. Send us a postcard if you feel like it. We wish you were here. Credits for this episode go out to Maxwell Williams for the snappy title music, Emmitt James for the musical interludes, Saskia Wilson-Brown, Alejandro, and the team at Dublab, and Cameron at Lookout FM. Support them so they can keep bringing you this education-based nonprofit radio station in Los Angeles and globally online at lookout.fm. Music featured in this episode is listed on our website at perfumeontheradio.com and is all in the public domain or used within the doctrine of fair use or with attribution, and our deep thanks for the community at freesound.com. This has been produced by the Institute for Art and Olfaction, and I have been your hostess, Minetta Rogers. These episodes are archived on perfumeontheradio.com, and we have shared some production notes from this episode there. We'll see you soon. Meanwhile, keep it kind, keep it real, and keep it smelly.
Love your perfume. What is that? The stench of death?
Perfume on the radio.
You're listening to Perfume on the Radio.
On lookout, Aztec.